History has a way of surprising us. Just when we think we know the story, discoveries come along that totally flip the script. I'm about to change everything you thought you knew. You ready? I'm Mike with List 25, and here are incredible discoveries that rewrite history. What lies behind some of the world's greatest inventions? Weed. In fact, this was the very first thing sold on the internet back in 1972. Yes, there was internet access in the 70s. Stanford University had the merchandise, and MIT wanted it. The drugs changed hands, and history was made. Makes you wonder what other incredible things were possibly created by stoners. Back in 1739, Britain and Spain were on bad terms, and Britain needed a reason to go to war. They found one in a strange event that happened 8 years earlier. In 1731, a British merchant captain named Robert Jenkins claimed his ship Rebecca was stopped by the Spanish Coast Guard. During the search, one of the Spanish officers cut off Jenkins' ear with a sword. At the time, no one in the British government seemed to care much. But when Britain was ready to go to war with Spain in 1739, Jenkins' severed ear became the excuse they needed. The conflict that followed became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, a war, quite literally, over an ear. While many Germans knew about the mass killings of Jewish people during the Holocaust, some were unaware of the full scope of the horrors in the concentration camps. By early 1945, approximately 1.1 million people had already been killed at Auschwitz alone. This photograph captured the raw reactions of German soldiers who were prisoners of war after being forced to watch footage of the concentration camps in 1945. I think it's safe to say that we're seeing shock and distress in response to the horrific reality they were confronted with. In that moment, the truth of their involvement could no longer be denied, and they were forced to confront the consequences of their role in the war. And that's it for today. I know, this list was not as cheerful and fun as some of the other ones we bring you, but nevertheless, it's an important one, even if it is painful. In the past 2 years, a series of discoveries have transformed our understanding of human evolution, revealing that so-called advanced behaviors emerged much earlier than we thought. Take architecture, for example. At Kalambo Falls in Zambia, archaeologists discovered logs that were shaped to interlock. And not just any logs. Logs that are 476,000 years old, crafted almost 200,000 years before Homo sapiens even existed. Then there's art. Neanderthals, long seen as primitive, are now credited with painting on cave walls, with new examples uncovered this year at La Roche-Cotard in France. Evidence even suggests that earlier species like Homo erectus carved patterns on shells, and in South Africa's Rising Star Cave, the debated Homo naledi might have created carvings and buried their dead. Together, these discoveries push us to rethink the roots of art, architecture, and social structures, showing that the origins of human behaviors are far older and more complex than we ever imagined, forcing us to rethink what truly makes us human. Juggling is an entertaining thing to watch, but apparently it can be handy in a war situation. Sheng Yi Liao, who was fighting for King Chuang of Chu in the 6th century ancient China, must have been a formidable juggler as well as a swordsman. He picked up 9 balls and reportedly dazzled his opponents. According to one version of the story, this display made the enemy so disturbed, they ran away. In May 1945, just before the end of World War II, one of the most unexpected battles took place at Castle Itter in Austria. The castle had been used by the Nazis to hold important French prisoners, like former prime ministers and generals. As the Nazis were falling apart, the SS guards abandoned the prisoners. Left unprotected, the prisoners ended up teaming up with some German soldiers who had switched sides, led by Major Josef Gangl and an American tank crew under Captain Jack Lee. Against the odds, the group fended off the SS assault, holding the castle long enough for US reinforcements to arrive and claim victory. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the intense heat from the blast burned shadows into nearby surfaces, capturing the outline of objects that had been there moments before. It happened with human victims too. Their silhouettes were seared into walls or steps, marking the spot where they stood or sat. This photo shows the haunting outline of a man who was sitting or walking on the stairs when the bomb struck. Can you imagine the power it takes to burn a human shadow into stone? Archaeologists in Egypt's Sinai Desert rediscovered 60 ancient carvings that shake up everything we thought we knew about Egypt's earliest rulers. One of the most surprising finds is a hieroglyphic inscription showing that Pharaoh Narmer's wife, Queen Neithotep, was in fact a queen in her own right, and that she ruled as regent for the young pharaoh Jur 5,000 years ago, long before famous queens like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra. Another unexpected revelation came with an inscription that suggests Egypt's ancient capital, Memphis, existed even before Narmer's time. Known as the White Walls, Memphis might have been around under a lesser-known ruler named Irihor, changing our timeline of the city's origin. And to top it all off, archaeologists found drawings of boats with early royal symbols, showing that Egypt's love of boats started way earlier than we thought. US President John Adams had a dog named after the Prince of Darkness. Because Adams was the first president to live in the White House, that made Satan the first White House pet. What breed was Satan? Oh, we don't know. But I'm guessing he was hell to clean up after. Depending on what year you were born, you might be very, or completely unfamiliar with this historical event. In July 1969, Senator Ted Kennedy was involved in a tragic car accident on Chappaquiddick Island. After leaving a party late at night, Kennedy's car plunged off a bridge and into the water. While Kennedy escaped, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, who was in the car with him, was trapped and tragically drowned. Even worse, Kennedy didn't report the accident until hours later, causing outrage and controversy. The scandal cast a massive shadow over Kennedy's political career and raised serious questions about his actions that night. This photo shows a Union soldier who barely survived Andersonville prison during the US Civil War. The Confederate camp became infamous for its horrific conditions. While soldiers outside were fed, prisoners often starved. Even though this man was freed in May 1865, the pain captured in this photo is impossible to ignore. It's a terrible reminder of the cruel ways Americans dehumanized one another during the Civil War. In 2022, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Stone Age hunter-gatherer with an amputated left leg, dating back an astounding 31,000 years. Found in an isolated limestone cave in Borneo, accessible only by boat in a grueling jungle trek, this skeleton reveals a truly astonishing level of medical knowledge. The team, led by Australian archaeologist Dr. Tim Maloney, found that the leg had been carefully amputated, with signs of healing indicating the person lived another 6 to 9 years post-surgery. Until now, the oldest known surgical amputation was a mere 7,000 years old. This Borneo find rewrites what we thought about ancient medicine, showing that early humans likely understood complex surgery, antiseptics, and post-op care long before we ever imagined. You've heard the word ostracized, right? It's when someone's banned from society. But where did it come from? Well, it dates back to ancient Greece. The ostracon was made from ceramic shards or limestone, and you could write on it. These became ancient voting slips for people wanting to decide who was ejected from the town when a controversy happened. Harriet Quimby was a true pioneer, bold, talented, and determined to make her mark. She didn't just break into one field. She wrote 6 Hollywood screenplays, modeled for a soft drink company, and then took to the skies. In 1911, Quimby became the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, and just 1 year later, she made history again as the first woman to fly solo across the English Channel. But her moment of triumph was completely overshadowed by the sinking of the Titanic, which happened the day before. Instead of the celebration she deserved, her achievement was largely forgotten as the world's attention turned to the tragedy at sea. Back in the early days of photography, smiles weren't common. Poor dental health and the long exposure times needed for photos meant people usually kept their faces neutral. By the time World War I arrived, there was even less to smile about. Millions lost their lives, and those who survived often dealt with PTSD, severe injuries, or the grief of losing loved ones. In this 1916 photo from the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, a soldier seems to be smiling as medical orderlies tend to the wounded in a trench. But look closer. That smile is hollow. The soldier is shell-shocked, a term coined during the war to describe the devastating mental toll on soldiers. That smile isn't comforting. It's incredibly sad once you realize the truth. Archaeologists uncovered a 90,000-year-old human middle finger bone, the oldest known human fossil outside of Africa and the Levant, at a site that was once teeming with lakes and animals, but is now a bone-dry desert. This single fossil places humans in Arabia around 85,000 years ago, which is 20,000 years earlier than previously believed. It also challenges the idea that humans left Africa in just 2 major waves, suggesting instead that migration was more complex, with multiple waves over time. As Michael Petraglia from the Max Planck Institute put it, these early journeys were far more complicated than our textbooks tell us, showing that early humans ventured far and wide much earlier than we'd ever imagined. In ancient Egypt, long before the police dog, criminals found themselves at the mercy of baboons. We know this because of artwork from the time. If you stepped out of line, chances are the pharaoh would want you torn to pieces by angry baboons. Just like canines, these animals were apparently trained and kept on leashes. In 1647, while New York was still the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, Harman Meindert van den Bogart, a well-known explorer and barber surgeon, was caught in a compromising position with a black slave. At the time, Dutch Calvinist law made sodomy punishable by death. After being arrested, Van den Bogart escaped from custody at Fort Orange, now Albany, with his girlfriend and fled to an Iroquois village. However, during a standoff, a longhouse was set on fire, and after a shootout, he was recaptured. In a tragic turn, Van den Bogart died during his second escape attempt, falling through the ice. A somber mark of one of America's first instances of persecution based on sexual orientation. In 1948, photographer David Seymour captured an unforgettable image of an 8-year-old girl named Tereska at a school for disturbed children in Warsaw. The assignment was simple: draw home. Tereska drew a chaotic tangle of lines. Tereska's trauma ran deep. At just 4 years old, her father was taken by the Gestapo, and she fled with her sister to their grandmother's house. The home was soon attacked, and during the chaos, Tereska was hit by shrapnel, which left her brain damaged. She and her sister wandered through the war zone for weeks before finding safety, but the psychological wounds never healed. Tereska spent the rest of her life in an asylum and passed away in 1978. Archaeologists have uncovered a 25-foot bridge hidden in a submerged cave in Majorca, Spain. This bridge dates back nearly 6,000 years, meaning humans explored and settled the Mediterranean about 1,600 years before any confirmed activity on the island. Discovered in the Genovesa cave, this bridge wasn't just a pile of rocks. It's clear that early settlers carefully built it, probably to get fresh water. Archaeologists dated the mineral deposits to verify the bridge's age, confirming this remarkable discovery and, in the process, rewriting the timeline of Mediterranean exploration. In the late 19th century, a medical article was published warning ladies against the dangers of bicycling, particularly the impact it might have on their looks. Yes, women, beware of the bicycle, unless you want to look like a tired horse with bulging eyes. So, is so-called bicycle face a real condition? No. It was a desperate attempt to stop feminists from feeling independent. Even riding a bike was seen as a rebellious act that had to be stopped. Most vice presidents stick to politics, but Charles Gates Dawes had a hidden talent. He wrote a hit song. Before becoming Calvin Coolidge's VP in 1925, Dawes was a banker and diplomat, but he also loved music. Back in 1911, he composed a piece called Melody in A Major for violin and orchestra. In 1951, Carl Sigman added lyrics, creating the pop song It's All in the Game. Tommy Edwards' version of the song hit number 1 on the charts in 1958, and it stayed there for 6 weeks, and hasn't faded into obscurity. Over the years, artists like Nat King Cole, Cliff Richard, and Barry Manilow have all put their own spin on it. In 1951, a group of Chinese soldiers knelt before a United Nations command soldier, terrified they were about to be executed. The looks on their faces say it all. At the time, Chinese forces, known as the People's Volunteer Army, had entered the war to support North Korea. Captured soldiers were sent to POW camps like the massive one on Koje Island. Life in these camps wasn't easy. Overcrowding, harsh conditions, and political indoctrination were the norm. The treatment and fate of these prisoners ultimately proved to be one of the biggest challenges of the armistice process. Archaeologists at Pompeii Archaeological Park recently uncovered the remains of a prison bakery where enslaved people and donkeys were locked together in cramped quarters to grind grain for bread. The small room, with only a few barred windows high on the walls, reveals a dark side of ancient labor. Deep indentations in the floor show where donkeys and enslaved people, blindfolded and yoked, walked in sync for hours in grueling forced labor. This discovery has shed new light on the brutal conditions of ancient slavery. Pompeii's director Gabriel Zuchtrigal called it the most shocking side of ancient slavery, reduced to brute violence. We obviously have a lot more to learn about the ancient cultural practices of Pompeii. If you visit Iran, you might want to change your hairstyle. You see, All hair-related stuff is under strict rules. They issued an approved haircut list in 2010. Ponytails are reportedly outlawed, and whatever you do not fly in there with a mullet. Why do they ban particular styles anyway? No, it's because of their connection to the West. I mean, I knew a mullet was bad, but I didn't know it could cause an international incident. In 1775, Sarah Tarrant, a strong-willed nurse from Salem, Massachusetts, came dangerously close to sparking the Revolutionary War before it officially began. British officer Alexander Leslie had arrived in Salem with his troops, hoping to seize artillery he believed was hidden by local rebels. But the townspeople weren't having it. Some young locals sabotaged Leslie's boat, while others, along with the Salem militia, blocked his path at a bridge, armed and ready for a standoff. Leslie, not wanting to provoke a full-blown conflict, eventually turned his troops back towards Boston to save face. As they left, Sarah Tarrant boldly cursed at the retreating soldiers. One furious redcoat aimed his musket at her, but luckily Leslie ordered him to hold fire, narrowly avoiding an early clash that could have ignited the war. Have you ever heard of the Radium Girls? In the 1920s, these women worked in factories painting watch dials with glow-in-the-dark radium paint. They were told the paint was harmless, and were even instructed to point their brushes with their lips to create a fine tip. But the radium was poisoning them. They started suffering from illnesses like jaw necrosis, anemia, and bone cancer. And by 1927, 5 of the women filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Radium Corporation. The case was settled in 1928, with each woman receiving $10,000 and a $600 annual annuity for as long as they lived, along with coverage of medical and legal expenses. However, most of them didn't live long enough to see justice fully served. A colossal geoglyph featuring intricate bird designs, including an enormous cockatoo, was discovered in the remote mountains of central Papua New Guinea in 2023. Spanning 40 meters wide and 80 meters tall, or 131 feet wide and 262 feet tall, this ancient artwork was spotted by remote explorer Gary Eastman using Google Earth. It's his second major find of the year, following a Thunderbird geoglyph discovery in the US. While known for its crafts like weaving and pottery, these indigenous communities had no documented history of large-scale stonework. Until now. It sounds strange, but way back in history, pink used to be considered a boy's color, and blue a girl's. The late 19th and early 20th century saw a kind of marketing push, where pink was described as a lighter form of red, or, to quote Donut, lightish red. So the babies of presumably red-blooded males were encouraged to wear pink outfits. Meanwhile, blue was targeted at blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls. By the 40s, customers had gone the other way, with blue for boys and pink for girls. Of course, today, people can wear whatever color they want to. Like this beige. After the Civil War, the residents of Van Zandt County in East Texas found themselves frustrated by federal occupation and martial law. Deciding they had had enough, they boldly declared independence from both Texas and the US, forming what they called the Free State of Van Zandt. Their attempt to secede didn't sit well with the government, and General Sheridan dispatched federal troops to quash the rebellion. But the Van Zandt army, having celebrated their independence with a bit too much enthusiasm and alcohol, didn't put up much of a fight. The rebellion ended with little resistance, and the so-called Free State was quickly absorbed back into the US. The Auschwitz album is the only surviving visual record of the mass murder process at the infamous concentration camp. Likely taken by SS photographers Ernst Hoffmann or Bernhard Walter, the images captured Hungarian Jews, many from the Borevo ghetto, as they underwent selection on the camp's ramp. At the time the photos were taken, the deportation of Hungarian Jews was at its height. Those deemed fit to work were sent into the camp, while others, children, the elderly, and the sick, were sent straight to the gas chambers. The Auschwitz album documented the process leading up to the killings and was donated by Yad Vashem in 1980 by Lily Jacob Zelmanovich Meir. In an incredible find, a 3,300-year-old shipwreck has been discovered 88 kilometers off the coast of northern Israel. Sitting upright at 1,600 meters deep, this Bronze Age wreck is officially the oldest ever found, with much of its cargo almost perfectly preserved. Spotted by the energy company Energean during a 2023 seafloor survey, the ship was packed with hundreds of amphorae, those classic double-handled jugs likely used to carry oil, wine, and other goods. Until now, researchers believe that Bronze Age sailors hugged coastlines, always keeping land in sight. But the distance of this ship from shore way out beyond any visible coast shows that ancient sailors were braver and more skilled than we thought, navigating open seas likely guided by the stars and planets. Are you struggling in your cycle race? Well, why not light a cigarette? Certain riders actually did this at the iconic Tour de France in the 1920s. The thinking was that smoking opened your lungs and increased the capacity. Did it work? Well, when was the last time you saw a professional athlete lighting up during a competition? The US has carried debt almost since its founding, with the first official debt recorded at $75 million in 1790 after the Revolutionary War. But in 1835, under President Andrew Jackson, the unthinkable happened. The national debt was paid off completely, making the US debt-free for the only time in its history. Jackson, a staunch advocate for fiscal responsibility, aggressively reduced the debt through budget cuts and land sales. However, this didn't last long. Just a year later, the US was back in debt, and the figure has grown ever since. The man in this photo is Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father. He is standing alone in the attic of the secret annex in Amsterdam, where he and his family hid from the Nazis during World War II. Otto was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust. Photographer Arnold Newman later described the emotional moment. As he photographed Otto, the bells of the Westertoren began to ring. Otto turned to Newman and said, "Those were the bells that Anne wrote about." Overcome with emotion, Otto broke down in tears, and Newman followed. It captured a moment of profound grief and continues to move people around the world. Lucara Diamond Corp recently unearthed a stunning 2,492-carat diamond at Botswana's Karowe mine. This is the second largest diamond ever found and the biggest discovery in over 120 years. The massive gem, discovered using advanced X-ray technology, has rewritten the story of diamond history. First, it challenges long-held beliefs about the rarity of such large stones, proving that monumental diamonds are still out there to be found. Lucara's X-ray system also sets a new standard for mining, showing how modern tech can preserve enormous stones that traditional methods would likely break. Whether this diamond will be auctioned, cut, or left unpolished remains to be seen. One thing you'll notice in Cuba is a surprising number of vintage American cars. This is because of the Cuban Revolution back in the 50s, which rocked the country and saw Fidel Castro take power. America imposed embargoes on the territory, so Castro outlawed US car imports. Despite ongoing tensions, there was sort of a plus side, in that these classic cars were kept in good condition. Back in 1784, a chunk of land west of the Appalachian Mountains, ceded by North Carolina to help pay off war debts, was turned into a self-proclaimed state called Franklin, or Frankland. The idea was to become the 14th state of the newly formed United States. Local leaders in Franklin even set up their own government, hoping to gain official statehood. But despite their efforts, Congress wasn't convinced. They fell just short of the votes needed for admission, and the dream of Franklin faded. Eventually, the land was absorbed back into North Carolina, and later became part of Tennessee. The Korean War caused monumental devastation. Over 3 million people died, hundreds of thousands displaced, and millions were left grieving their loved ones. In many cases, children had to step into parental roles after losing their families. Taken on September 6, 1951, this photograph shows a young Korean girl carrying her brother on her back as she walks past a stalled M26 Pershing tank near Hangzhou. It shows the profound challenges endured by ordinary people in a war that tore families apart. The general consensus has always been that we started talking about 200,000 years ago. That timeline has been moved to 1.6 million years ago. Archaeologist Stephen Mithin studied ancient tools and brain structures and skeletons from southern and eastern Africa and found that as early humans' brains grew and their vocal tracts changed, they began using simple words and sentences. They used language to help them with their hunting and planning, and even to pass down skills, which helped them to survive. The best part? Mithin believes some of these early sounds might still be here with us. Just like we say buzz or crash, early humans might have used sounds that matched actions, maybe even whoosh for movement. So for all we know, oomph could have been around since the very start. Polly want a cracker? Sure. Polly wants to teach an ancient language? The German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt traveled to Latin America in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He found a tribe with a parrot who spoke the lost language of their enemies. They'd taken the bird, and inadvertently, the language too. This bizarre parrot system has later been used in museums to keep the old ways alive. During the Civil War, some wounded soldiers noticed something strange. Certain injuries started glowing with a bluish-green light. It might have seemed creepy at first, but what made it even more fascinating was that the soldiers with glowing wounds were healing faster and had fewer infections than others. Doctors were completely baffled and had no idea why this was happening, so they give it the nickname Angel's Glow. It wasn't until 2001 that scientists finally figured out what was going on. The glow came from a bacteria called Photohabdus luminescens, which thrives in cool, damp environments like Civil War battlefields. Surprisingly, this bacteria actually produces natural antibiotics, which explains why the soldiers with glowing wounds healed more quickly. What seemed like a strange miracle turned out to be nature lending a helping hand. The Ebensee concentration camp was set up in 1943 as a sub-camp of Mauthausen to force prisoners to build underground tunnels for military use. Over 27,000 men passed through the camp, many of them Jewish, and the conditions were horrific. Prisoners were starved, overworked, and subjected to Nazi racial policies that treated some groups worse than others. When American forces finally liberated the camp on May 6, 1945, they found thousands of emaciated prisoners and unburied bodies. In spite of medical assistance, 750 prisoners died from starvation and disease shortly after their liberation. We all know that the Sumerians built some of the world's first cities thousands of years ago, and for the longest time, historians assumed these early cities were basic and chaotic, densely packed around towering ziggurats. But recent discoveries at the ancient city of Lagash are flipping that assumption on its head. Archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania found that Lagash was laid out in organized districts, divided by walls and canals, a surprising level of planning for such an early city. Though Lagash was abandoned more than 2,000 years ago, it's remained largely intact because later generations didn't build over it. Today, it's teaching us that the ancient Sumerians weren't just the first urbanites, they were incredibly savvy city planners too. That's the percent of idiots who believe you get chocolate milk from brown cows. Over 16 million people surveyed by the Innovation Center of U.S. Dairy in 2017 linked the color of the cow to the flavor of the milk. This is a relatively recent survey, but it shows that people still believe old stories no matter how crazy they sound. It's a nice idea, but the only brown stuff coming out of a cow is, well, you know. In 1957, a dangerous new respiratory virus surfaced in East Asia, and before long, it was spreading across the world. Health experts at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research quickly stepped in, arranging to bring samples of the virus to the US for testing. What they discovered was alarming. The H2N2 virus was unlike any flu Americans had seen before, leaving the entire population vulnerable. The pandemic lasted 2 years, claiming nearly 70,000 lives in the US and millions more worldwide. Although it's not as well remembered as other outbreaks, it serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly a virus can spread and how easily we can forget these kind of tragedies. On June 6, 1944, photographer Robert F. Sargent captured American soldiers disembarking from a landing craft at Omaha Beach during D-Day. The photo, titled "Taxis to Hell and Back into the Jaws of Death," shows soldiers wading through deadly waters toward the heavily defended shores of Normandy. The original caption actually described the danger best. Enemy fire will cut down some of them. Their taxi will pull itself off the sands and dash back for more passengers. D-Day claimed almost 10,000 Allied lives. A lot of the fallen were buried at the Normandy American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, but more than 1,500 soldiers' bodies were never recovered from the beaches nor the surrounding waters. Rome's empire building was anything but timid, stretching from Scotland to Iraq by the early 2nd century. Historians have long thought that Rome never attempted to conquer Arabia, relying instead on trade with its tribes. However, a 2023 discovery by Oxford researchers may prove otherwise. Using satellite images, they spotted 3 unmistakable Roman military camps along the Saudi Arabia-Jordan border, suggesting a covert Roman push deeper into Arabia. These camps could have been staging points for a campaign against the Nabatean kingdom, which controlled the prized city of Petra. Though Rome annexed Nabatea in 106, these camps hint at larger, possibly unfinished ambitions. I think it's safe to say that not even Arabia's deserts were beyond Rome's reach. Incredibly, Khan was fairly open on the subject of religion. You could easily be slaughtered by Khan and his hordes, but it wouldn't be due to your belief system. Actually, many argue that he's one of the most misunderstood warlords in history. There are a few myths surrounding him, such as the idea that he had any hordes at all. In 1985, a long-standing conflict between the Philadelphia Police and MOVE, a black liberation and environmental activist group, came to a tragic head. On May 13th, police ordered members of MOVE to leave their fortified home in a West Philadelphia neighborhood. Inside were 7 adults and 6 children. When MOVE refused to leave, over 500 officers surrounded the house. After tear gas failed to force them out and a gunfight broke out, police made an unthinkable decision. They dropped a bomb from a helicopter onto the building. The bomb caused a fire that killed 11 people, including 5 children. As if that wasn't already bad enough, instead of putting out the blaze, the authorities let it burn. And it destroyed 61 nearby homes, leaving more than 250 people homeless. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 led to the forced relocation and incarceration of around 120,000 Japanese Americans. Families were uprooted from their homes and sent to internment camps. 2/3 of those affected were U.S. citizens. By January 1945, the exclusion order was lifted and Japanese Americans were allowed to return home. But returning wasn't easy. Many found their homes vandalized, occupied, or sold, and hostility from neighbors was common. This photo, taken in May 1945, shows a Japanese family in Seattle returning to their house, only to find "No Japs Wanted" scrawled on the walls. It's long been believed that Christopher Columbus and his crew introduced tuberculosis to the Americas in the late 15th century, leading to a devastating decline in Native American populations. However, DNA evidence tells a different story. We now know that seals brought TB to the Americas centuries before Columbus arrived. Scientists made the discovery when they analyzed 1,000-year-old human remains in Peru. The DNA test showed that the TB strain these individuals carried is most similar to the strain found in seals and sea lions, not in humans from Europe. Researchers think these marine animals picked up the disease during African TB outbreaks and carried it across the ocean, where indigenous people contracted it through seal hunting. Did you know that freedom fighter turned world leader Nelson Mandela came from a high-profile background? He was a member of the Xhosa royal family. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniswa, was a local chief, and his great-grandfather was in charge of the Eastern Cape province in South Africa. The injustice of apartheid fired up young Nelson, who ended up spending a large chunk of his life as a political prisoner before becoming president of South Africa in 1994. In 1968, a Soviet submarine armed with nuclear missiles disappeared in the Pacific Ocean, sparking a frantic search. Both the US and the Soviets were racing to find it. But after months of searching, the Soviets gave up. The Americans, though, weren't ready to quit. They managed to pinpoint the wreck using top-secret Air Force technology. But here's the tricky part. How do you raise a Soviet submarine without them finding out? That's where billionaire Howard Hughes came in. He agreed to help by pretending to be running a deep-sea mining operation. It worked like a charm, and the US was able to recover parts of the sub without the Soviets ever suspecting a thing. During World War II, the Nazis kidnapped an estimated 20,000 Polish children with Aryan features to assimilate them into German society. 8-year-old Zita Sus was one of them. Taken from an orphanage in Łódź, Poland in 1942, she was sent to a re-education center, and later to the Reichsschule für Volksdeutsche in Aachen, where speaking Polish was strictly forbidden. After the war, Zita returned to Poland, but was never reunited with her biological family. The Garamantes were an ancient African civilization once known mainly through their capital, Jarma. However, in 2011, satellite imagery revealed over 100 fortified settlements deep in the Sahara, dating back to 1500. These walled towns, with structures still standing 13 feet high, have revealed a complex society that not only survived, but thrived in the desert. The Garamantes engineered an advanced irrigation system, creating oases by channeling groundwater to the surface, in the process allowing crops to flourish in one of Earth's driest places. They had sophisticated urban centers, trade networks, and hydraulic technology, and connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. The discovery has challenged the view that North Africa's history was predominantly shaped by external empires and highlighted the significant achievements of indigenous African societies. Before the mid-19th century, British soldiers weren't allowed to grow beards. In fact, facial hair wasn't seen as appropriate in society in general. When the Crimean War happened, it changed everything. It was cold out there, so a fuzzy layer of protection was needed. Plus, fighting men didn't have the time or resources to give themselves a shave. The hero status that came with the beards led to an explosion of face fungus in the, hey, Victorian era. Face fungus! Rude. The horrors of Canada's residential school system have only recently gained wider attention. Beginning in 1894, the government forced Indigenous children to attend these schools, run by religious institutions, with the goal of severing their ties to their culture and assimilating them into European Canadian society. The abuse was widespread, physical, emotional, and cultural. It's estimated that up to 30,000 children died from the neglect and mistreatment they suffered, a staggering 20% of all those enrolled. The trauma didn't stop with those who attended. It rippled through generations, leaving deep scars on Indigenous communities with high rates of PTSD, alcoholism, and self-harm. Blanche Monnier, a member of a prominent aristocratic family in Poitiers, France, was confined to a tiny dark room by her mother and brother for 26 years. She was finally discovered in 1901 when police found her after an anonymous tip led them to the house. By then, Blanche was middle-aged, dangerously thin, and living in horrific conditions. She hadn't seen sunlight for nearly 3 decades. According to reports at the time, her imprisonment was the result of her desire to marry someone her family didn't approve of. In the early 1900s, archaeologists unearthed a 3,700-year-old clay tablet in Iraq and named it Plimpton 322. For decades, its cuneiform number pattern puzzled scholars until 2017, when researchers finally discovered its purpose. It was the world's oldest and most accurate trigonometric table, predating Greek trigonometry by over a millennium. The Babylonians used an ingenious system based on ratios instead of angles, which was simpler and often more precise. This tablet wasn't just a teaching tool. Plimpton 322 was powerful enough to assist in building massive architectural feats, including palaces, and yes, even pyramids. Ancient Romans attending the bloody and brutal activities at the Colosseum could buy their own piece of the action in the form of cosmetics. I'm sorry, hang on. Gladiators and makeup? Was that a thing? It certainly was. People used a product made using the actual sweat of those poor fighters. It was said to help with their complexion. Fun for the fans, and pretty horrible for the competitors. Dashrath Manji, a laborer from a small village in eastern India, turned a personal tragedy into an extraordinary mission. After his wife died because she couldn't reach a hospital in time due to the mountainous terrain, Manji vowed to make sure no one else would suffer the same fate. Armed with only a hammer and chisel, he took on the impossible, carving a path through the mountain that had blocked his village's access to the nearest city. Manji chipped away at the rock for more than 22 years, eventually creating a 360-foot-long, 30-foot-wide path. In the end, what was once a 35-mile detour became a 15-minute walk, proving that, with enough determination, even mountains can be moved. In 1948, George W. McLaurin became the first African-American admitted to the University of Oklahoma, where he pursued a doctorate in education. But even after he was accepted, segregation rules didn't go away. McLaurin was made to sit apart from white students, sometimes in separate rooms or areas labeled reserved for colored. The same treatment followed him to the library, cafeteria, and other parts of campus. McLaurin challenged the policies, saying they hurt his education. His fight made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor in 1950. That decision struck a blow against segregation and helped set the stage for civil rights advances in education. In 2017, researchers discovered the world's oldest ochre crayons and stone axes crafted by the Aboriginal people, the world's oldest continuous civilization, at the Majibebe Rock Shelter in Australia's Northern Territory. These artifacts push back the timeline of Aboriginal arrival in Australia to as early as 65,000 years ago, nearly 18,000 years earlier than previously thought. The tools show they had advanced skills and likely coexisted with Australia's extinct megafauna. This find not only transformed our understanding of Australian history, but also narrowed the timeline for human migration out of Africa, suggesting humans were spreading across the globe much earlier than expected. And real quick, if you're enjoying this, please don't forget to give it a like, comment, share, subscribe, do all that. It really helps the channel. Thank you so much. You've probably seen the French Palace of Versailles in movies and TV shows looking immaculate and gorgeous, and it was. But apparently it had a major P problem. As in, people relieving themselves over the floors and walls of this architectural masterpiece. Why did they do this? Well, there were toilets, but those tended to leak. Let me put it this way. You didn't want to be in the room underneath. In 1939, as Europe stood on the edge of World War II, a British businessman by the name of Sir Nicholas Winton quietly devised a plan that would save hundreds of lives. Born to Jewish parents, Winton organized Operation Kindertransport, a secret mission to rescue 669 Jewish children from Czechoslovakia who were at risk of being sent to concentration camps. He worked tirelessly to find foster homes for the children in England and arrange for their safe passage. But most remarkably, Winton kept his heroic efforts a secret, even from his wife. It wasn't until years later when she discovered a scrapbook detailing the rescues that the world learned of his incredible bravery. In 1890s Germany, mental health treatments often involved methods now considered inhumane. One such practice was known as forced standing, and as you can see, the patients were basically just made to stand in crucifixion-like poses for extended periods. At the time, mental health care in Germany was heavily institutionalized. Patients frequently endured overcrowded and grim conditions, and the prescribed treatments were more focused on containment than care. Wine has long been a staple of Italian culture, but where did it all really begin? While exploring Monte Cronio, US researchers found large brewer's pots that seemed unremarkable, until they tested the residue inside. The pots contain tartaric acid and sodium salt, clear indicators of grape fermentation, which means they were used for winemaking. And here's the wow moment. Monte Cronio dates back to the Copper Age, early 4th millennium BCE. Until the discovery, experts believed Italian winemaking started in the Middle Bronze Age, around 1300 to 1100 BCE. So this pushes Italy's wine history back nearly 2,000 years. And yes, I understand this is a Malbec and this is, Argentinian. This is all I have. It's a visual aid. It's not perfect. I could have gotten my Manischewitz. For so long, we associated the achievements of NASA with sweaty-looking guys in mission control and brave male astronauts. In more recent times, the role of women has been highlighted, such as Margaret Hamilton. She was the team leader at MIT, or the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, when software was being developed for use in the classic Apollo moon missions. I'm talking computer code here. Pages and pages of it in an age before everything went on a hard drive. Hamilton was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016 and even had a Lego figure made of herself. On February 15, 1933, during a rally in Miami, Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak found himself sitting next to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in a convertible. As they talked, an unemployed Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Zangara, who struggled with mental illness, attempted to assassinate the president. Instead of hitting Roosevelt, Zangara's shot struck Cermak and 4 others. On the way to the hospital, Cermak reportedly told the president, "I'm glad it was me instead of you." Those words, immortalized on his gravestone, capture the courage he showed during a moment that might have rewritten history. In 1904, a young Filipino girl was tied to a pole and displayed at the Coney Island Zoo. She was part of a group of 1,300 indigenous Filipinos brought to the U.S. to showcase the country's new control over the Philippines. Placed among monkeys and lizards, she was bound by ropes and treated as an attraction. Visitors even threw peanuts at her. The shocking display was one of many at the time, when indigenous people were exploited and put on public display, all under the pretense of promoting colonial power and educating the public. For decades, scientists thought the lumps of tar they found in German caves were just basic adhesives. But, as it turns out, there's something much more impressive. 200,000-year-old multi-component glue created by Neanderthals, putting them way ahead of early humans, who didn't start making glue until 130,000 years later. The research from France's Le Moustier region team found that Neanderthals had a unique recipe, mixing bitumen and ochre to create a sticky, grip-friendly adhesive for their tools. They even sourced these materials from far-off locations, showing a surprising level of planning. So, Neanderthals were, in fact, clever problem solvers with their own spin on toolmaking, challenging everything we thought we knew about human innovation and ancient intelligence. Mary Fields, aka Stagecoach Mary, was one tough lady. She had to be. After all, she was the first woman of color to deliver mail in the Wild West. Mary liked to drink, and she was a skilled shooter, so you didn't mess with her. Can you believe she actually used to live in a covenant? She was born a slave, and as well as delivering mail, she also operated as an entrepreneur and restaurateur. Mary joined the Postal Service in 1895, earning a reputation as a formidable and intimidating delivery woman. She may have been a scary Mary, but she was reportedly kind to those who didn't cross her, and she loved kids. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when something you rely on every day suddenly fails? That's exactly what happened in March 1928 when the St. Francis Dam in California, designed by William Mulholland, collapsed out of nowhere. Built to supply water and power to LA, it stood for just 2 years before massive flood tore through the Santa Clara River Valley, killing over 450 people. This disaster really shook people's faith in big engineering projects, and honestly, I can see why. Afterward, there was no choice but to ask tough questions, which led to stricter safety measures to prevent anything like this from happening again. 15 minutes after the atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, a photographer captured the massive mushroom cloud towering over the devastated city. The bomb claimed between 50 and 100,000 lives. Entire families and neighborhoods were wiped out, making an accurate count impossible. Most of the victims were civilians, children, the elderly, and women. In the years that followed, radiation-related illnesses and birth defects continued to claim lives, and thousands suffered long-term health consequences. Ani, once the thriving capital of the Kingdom of Armenia and famously called the City of 1001 Churches, is a site rich with history. After centuries of prosperity and a complex series of conquests, Ani was eventually abandoned, and much of its above-ground glory was destroyed in the early 20th century. Then, in 2014, researchers announced a discovery that changed everything. They had found an entire underground city beneath Ani's ruins. The hidden complex includes a monastery, a school, monk cells, rock-cut houses, and over 800 structures connected by a network of tunnels. This revelation reframes Ani not just as a lost city, but as a once vibrant center of learning and spirituality, deepening our understanding of Armenia's historical and cultural influence in the region. If you were driving a tank in World War II and you saw a dog running toward you with something strapped to its back, well, it was game over for you. You, and sadly the dog. This move by the Red Army, who created anti-tank dogs, was no fun for the animal. It is actually shocking to hear that they exploded the dogs once they got under the tank. Before becoming Pope Pius II in 1458, Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini had already made a name for himself as a writer. Among his works is a rather surprising novel called The Tale of Two Lovers, which was filled with sensual imagery and scandalous content. Written in the form of letters exchanged between two lovers, this book is considered one of the earliest examples of the epistolary novel. Originally published in 1467, long before Piccolomini's papacy, the novel's racy content stands in stark contrast to his later role as Pope, raising eyebrows even centuries after his time. On April 17, 1912, the Mackay Bennett left Nova Scotia to recover the bodies from the Titanic disaster. The ship was chartered by the White Star Line for $500 a day and carried coffins, canvas bags, embalming supplies, and a team of embalmers. Most of the victims did not drown, but died from hypothermia. Their bodies were discovered frozen and grouped together, with a lot of them still wearing life jackets. Of the 1,517 Titanic victims, 337 bodies were recovered. Many are unidentified to this day and were buried under numbered headstones in Halifax Cemetery. In 2019, the British Library dusted off a tablet that hadn't seen the light of day since the 70s. At first, it looked almost modern, a child's handwriting copying an adult's phrases. But this wasn't recent. It was an Egyptian homework tablet from 1,800 years ago. On it, a young student, likely a boy from a prominent family, since high-status Egyptians were taught Greek, copied Greek proverbs, urging him to avoid bad friends and seek wisdom from the wise. The simple artifact offers us a rare glimpse into ancient education, revealing that moral lessons and intellectual training were part of the classroom experience long before modern schooling came along. The tongue of a flamingo was an edible status symbol for the upper classes of Rome. This Phoenicopterus, the ancient word for flamingo, was roasted and enjoyed in the finest houses by the richest individuals. Recommended by Roman foodies, the tongue was thought to be especially delicious. If you were really brave, you could eat the brains. That just reminds me of the sad story of Pinky the Flamingo from Busch Gardens. Don't look it up, it's sad. Although it has a very justice-filled ending. That's on you if you look it up. Jörg Jenatsch was a Swiss pastor turned politician who played a key role during the 30 Years' War. In 1639, after being knighted for his service to Switzerland, Jenatsch threw a lavish party in the city of Chur, which happened to coincide with a large carnival. Amid the celebrations, a group of masked carnival goers knocked on the door, including one man dressed as a bear. They were allowed to join the party, but things soon took a dark turn. The man in the bear costume suddenly produced an axe and brutally murdered Jenatsch in front of his horrified guests. While the attack is widely believed to be revenge killing, the assassin's true identity was never confirmed. In 1862, Peter, an enslaved man in Louisiana, endured a brutal whipping that left him scarred for life. Peter was held on a 3,000-acre plantation owned by John and Bridget Lyons, along with more than 40 others. After escaping in March 1863, he made it to Baton Rouge, where he shared how the beating left him bedridden for 2 months. According to some accounts, Peter then went on to enlist in the Union Army's U.S. colored troops, but there are no definitive records to confirm his movements. His ultimate fate remains a mystery. There's an old weathered temple dedicated to the goddess Patini on India's western coast. At first glance, this doesn't seem too unusual, until you learn that, according to local lore, it conceals an underground shrine to the Egyptian goddess Isis. Now, I know you want to hear about actual discoveries, but nobody's been allowed to fully explore it, as the site is managed by a Hindu organization. However, according to historian Chris Morgan, the theory that it's an Isis shrine might be more than just local legend. According to him, an Egyptian traveler may have brought Isis worship to India, mixing it with local practices, as both Patini and Isis have violent deaths and dismemberments of their husbands as defining characteristics. If true, this find would hint at ancient cultural exchanges, showing that Egyptian influence may have subtly worked its way into early Hindu practices through unexpected routes. Gin was a huge deal back in 18th century England. In 1730, for example, people drank over 13.5 million liters of it. Authorities decided to outlaw brandy from France, so gin took the top spot. Cheap booze for all. It was bad for the men and also the women, who were criticized for enjoying gin. That's why they called it Mother's Ruin. Eventually, the ingredients became pricier and the craze died out. In March 1944, Finnish soldier Aimo Koivunen found himself separated from his squad while fleeing a Soviet attack near the Arctic Circle. Exhausted and freezing, he turned to the Pervitin pills in his pocket, methamphetamine provided by the Finnish army to boost energy in desperate situations. But in his panic, he didn't just take one dose. He swallowed all 30 tablets meant for his entire unit. What followed was an incredible, nearly 3-week ordeal during which Koivunen skied nonstop through the Arctic wilderness, surviving without food or shelter. When he finally reappeared in Finnish territory, he had covered 250 kilometers, weighed just 94 pounds, and had his heart beating at over 200 beats a minute. This haunting photo is almost too terrible to discuss. It shows Nsala, a man living in the Congo Free State under the brutal rule of King Leopold II of Belgium. In 1904, Nsala failed to meet his daily rubber collection quota. As punishment, the Belgian overseer severed his 5-year-old daughter's hand and foot, later killing both her and his wife. The photo shows Nsala staring at the dismembered remains of his child. Millions of men, women, and children were subjected to forced labor and mutilation during Leopold's reign. 10 million people died. In 1857, a Comanche Native American stood before a crowd and shared an intriguing story. He spoke of a race of white men who were supposedly giants, 10 feet tall, immensely wealthy, and powerful. According to him, they roamed the land long before Europeans arrived, driving indigenous people from their homes. At the time, this tale seemed like a parable, until something shocking surfaced. Archaeologists later found a Greek medallion and 2 coins in Oklahoma. These artifacts led genealogist Donald Yates to re-examine Native American legends, and he uncovered similar stories among other tribes, like the Choctaws in Tennessee. Even the Greek historian Strabo mentioned a western continent, hinting at an ancient knowledge of the Americas. Could Greek explorers have arrived centuries before Columbus? If true, it would upend our timeline of early American history, suggesting a hidden chapter of cross-continental contact, and maybe even conflict. The ancient Romans were known for their sophisticated approach to various things in society. One of these was drainage, and a special goddess made the whole stinky business a little classier. Cloacina, possibly taken from cloaca or the Latin word for sewer, had her own shrine built over the Cloaca Maxima. This was a Etruscan drainage canal turned underground sewer system. Say your vows, hold your nose, and pray that the sewage is carried far away. In the 50s, after Jonas Salk developed the first effective polio vaccine, the US government quickly began mass production to protect children nationwide. However, Cutter Laboratories in Berkeley, California, accidentally produced around 120,000 doses that contained the live polio virus. The consequences were devastating. 5 children died, 113 were paralyzed, and 40,000 contracted a milder form of polio. Of those, 56 children developed severe cases that impacted their central nervous system. Following what became known as the Cutter incident, parents were understandably hesitant about vaccinating their children. Although still do. That was in the 50s. The R-38 airship, a product of ambitious military engineering, was designed during World War I for long-range patrols over the sea. After the war, the unfinished project was sold to the United States Navy, which hoped to develop airships for its fleet. However, on its 4th test flight, the R-38 suffered a structural failure, exploding midair and crashing into the Humber estuary in northeast England. Of the 49 people on board, only 5 survived. During a 2023 dig at Ukraine's Korolevo site, archaeologists uncovered stone tools dating back roughly 1.4 million years. That's right, way before Homo sapiens even existed. Previously, researchers believed early human ancestors didn't set foot in Europe until around 800,000 years ago. But this discovery pushes that date back by hundreds of thousands of years, suggesting that early human species, possibly Homo erectus, were already exploring Europe and adapting to its diverse landscapes far earlier than we ever imagined. People used radium toothpaste as recently as a century or so back. Yep, radioactive material around your gums. What could go wrong? Consumers thought this was the right and healthy thing to do. Radiation was good for cancer, so why not other issues? So radium became an ingredient in various products. It took until 1938 for US authorities to crack down on the hazardous business. Henrietta Wood was born into slavery around 1818, and unfortunately, her fight for freedom didn't end when she escaped to Ohio, a free state, in 1844. After being illegally kidnapped by slave hunter Zebulon Ward in 1853, she was forced back into slavery until the Emancipation Proclamation finally freed her. Determined to seek justice, Wood filed a lawsuit against Ward in 1869 for lost wages and damages. In a historic ruling, she was awarded $2,500, a significant amount at the time, equivalent to roughly $50,000 to $60,000 today. Her win marked a critical, though rare, step towards accountability for the horrors of slavery. On January 21, 1960, part of the Colebrook mine in the Free State, province of South Africa, collapsed while 1,000 miners were underground. Although hundreds managed to escape, 435 remained trapped. Over the course of 2 weeks, rescuers used sound devices to detect any signs of life in the mine's depths. Sadly, all 435 died. Their bodies were never recovered. In 2024, a research team from the University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria uncovered something unexpected along the Canary Islands coastline: fragments of Roman amphorae and ceramics from around the 1st century BCE. For a long time, historians believed that the Canary Islands remained isolated until around the 14th century when they were rediscovered by Europeans. But this find flips that story on its head. Were the islands a secret Roman outpost? A stop on an unknown trade route? Either way, it's a game changer, expanding our picture of Roman exploration far beyond the Mediterranean. Ancient Rome and pirates? It was a thing. The Captain Jack Sparrow of the year 75 BCE managed to get his hands on mighty Caesar himself. Caesar was only a student back then, but this guy knew how to lead, at least according to the historian Plutarch, who told us this story. The pirates had trouble keeping Caesar in line while out on the Aegean Sea. He spent just over a month as their so-called prisoner before being ransomed. Caesar then went on a revenge mission, capturing the pirates and having them crucified. The term defenestration may sound oddly specific, but it literally means throwing someone out of a window with deadly intent. And in 1618, this dramatic act sparked a conflict that would rage for decades. Known as the Defenestration of Prague, this event unfolded at Prague Castle, when Protestant nobles, frustrated by Catholic officials, decided to throw 2 of them out of a window. Miraculously, the 2 men survived after landing in a pile of manure, thwarting the Protestants' immediate plan. However, the event set off a much larger chain reaction, leading directly to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict that would reshape Europe. Years of turmoil, World War I and the Russian Civil War, left Russia's economy in ruins. When a severe drought struck in 1921, it pushed already desperate conditions over the edge. The famine devastated the regions around the Volga and Ural rivers and led to the deaths of an estimated 5 million people. Barefoot and sitting on the ground, these families are only a small fraction of the millions who suffered during the fatal period. A group of archaeologists digging around Yorkshire in 2021 came across what they believe to be Britain's oldest salt-making site from the Neolithic era, or about 10,000 BCE. I know, but what's so special about salt to feature on today's list, right? But back then, it was a huge deal. Salt wasn't just for flavor. It was essential for keeping food from spoiling and was valuable enough to trade. And this wasn't some small-time setup either. They found ancient pits and hearths where people were boiling down salt water in what looks like an early industrial operation. The team from the University of York was blown away. Their discovery shows that these early Britons weren't just roaming around hunting and gathering. They were organized, skilled at production, and likely trading with nearby communities. It completely changes how we see prehistoric Britain, more advanced and connected than we ever thought.